The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, bathing the Santa Helena countryside in a golden glow. The sound of insects and the wind rustling through the leaves of the trees were the only things that broke the absolute silence that reigned on Juan El Toro Garcia's small farm. A strong, robust man with a face marked by scars from old battles. But behind that tough exterior, Juan had chosen a quiet life in the countryside after abandoning his successful career as a martial arts fighter. His desire was to live in peace, away from the violence and tensions of the outside world. However, something or someone was about to disrupt that calm. The days in Santa Helena passed slowly, until one day an unexpected threat arrived in the town, a threat that neither Juan nor anyone else expected. Two men arrived on motorcycles with a menacing air, seeking to impose their law. Their presence was the first indication that something dangerous was about to happen. Although Juan had left behind the fighting and the chaos, he couldn't ignore what was coming. His fighter past was still alive in his body, in his mind, and in his ability to face any challenge that arose. The tranquility of Santa Helena was being disturbed, and what seemed to be an isolated town would soon become the scene of a conflict that would test the limits of his inner peace. Juan's story was just beginning, and what followed could change his life forever. It was a warm afternoon in the small town of Santa Helena, where life moved slowly and peacefully. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with orange hues as Juan El Toro Garcia walked toward his farm. Juan, a robust 55-year-old man, a former professional martial arts fighter, had chosen to retire to this remote corner of the world. His face, marked by scars from old battles, showed a calm, almost serene expression. No one in town knew much about his past, and he liked to keep it that way. He lived alone in a modest house surrounded by trees and fertile land. As he walked along the path leading to his farm, the sound of motorcycle engines broke the stillness of the countryside. It wasn't common in Santa Helena, a place where peace was the rule. Juan looked up and saw two men approaching, their motorcycles roaring beneath them. They didn't seem to be from the town. Their hard stares and visible tattoos made it clear that they weren't peaceful visitors. However, Juan showed no emotion. He had dealt with much worse things throughout his life. The men arrived at the gate of his house. The older one, a burly guy with a messy beard, got off first. His partner, younger with a scar across his face, also dismounted from his motorcycle. Both looked at Juan with disdain as if they were evaluating something. The older man was the first to speak. "Listen, old man, this is our territory now, and you..." He paused, looking him up and down. "You better pay us to leave you alone." Juan remained silent for a moment, observing the two men with an almost unsettling calm. His body, although seemingly aged, was still strong, and his eyes, despite everything he had experienced, shone with a light of determination. He wasn't a man of many words. He knew that the confrontation was inevitable. "I don't have any money, but if you're looking for trouble, you'll find it," Juan replied in a firm voice, but without raising his voice. The younger man, who wasn't expecting such a direct answer, let out a nervous laugh as if he was about to launch into an attack. However, the older man raised a hand, stopping him. "We don't want to make this difficult, friend," the older man said, but his eyes gleamed with a veiled threat. "But if you don't give us what we want, things could get ugly." Juan didn't move. His posture, so calm, seemed as if he didn't care at all about the threat of the two thugs. Despite his hard stare, the years of fighting had left him with an inner peace that couldn't be disturbed by the intimidations of a few simple thugs. "What do you want from me?" Juan asked, without taking his eyes off them. The older man gestured towards the land around the farm, as if he were claiming all that area for himself. "This land is very valuable. We know you don't have any money, but maybe we can reach an agreement." Juan stared at him. There was no need for words anymore. The air tensed, and the young drug dealer took a step forward, waiting for his boss to give the signal to attack. But the older man stopped him again, glancing sideways at Juan. "Let's get out of here," he said suddenly, without much explanation. Both got on their motorcycles and left without looking back, leaving Juan standing at his door, watching them fade into the distance. The wind blew softly, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees. Something inside him told him that this wasn't a simple threat. Something big was about to happen in Santa Helena, and he, although he wasn't looking for it, would be involved in it. The next day dawned grey in Santa Helena. Clouds covered the sky, and a light rain began to fall, soaking the dry land of Juan's farm. This type of weather usually calmed him, reminding him of the cold nights when, as a young man, he prepared for an important fight. However, that morning something in the air indicated that something wasn't right. Juan was in the shed, repairing a fence that had been damaged after a past storm, when he heard the roar of motorcycles again. This time, the sound was louder, closer. Juan put the tool on the ground and approached the entrance of the farm. From there, he saw the same two men as the previous afternoon advancing towards his house. This time, however, they weren't coming with the same relaxed attitude as before. They looked more determined, more dangerous. The older man, the leader of the two, seemed to have made a decision. It wasn't going to be so easy to ignore them anymore. As if he knew it, Juan stood still at the door of his house, watching the approach of the two thugs with an unsettling calm. The men arrived again and stopped in front of him. The younger one, with the scar on his face, quickly got off his motorcycle and approached Juan, this time without the mocking smiles of yesterday. "This isn't a simple warning," he said in a grave voice, while his partner, the leader, remained on the motorcycle, watching from afar with his arms crossed. "We're not playing anymore. If you don't join us, we're going to make you pay dearly." Juan watched both of them unperturbed. He knew what this situation meant. The thugs weren't going to leave so easily, and now, clearly, they were more determined. The young man took a step closer, showing his knife with the intention of intimidating. "Do you really think you can handle us, old man?" He mocked, circling around Juan as if he were evaluating him. Juan didn't respond. Instead, he turned around slowly and entered the house. The thugs looked at each other, confused by Juan's indifferent attitude. Didn't he understand that they were there to force him to do what they wanted? Suddenly, the older man got off the motorcycle and approached, this time with a more serious attitude. "I'm warning you one more time, old man," he said, this time in a more somber tone. "If you don't cooperate, not only will you suffer, but the whole town will be affected. This isn't just a deal with you, it's something much bigger." The silence became heavy between them. The wind blew strongly, moving the leaves of the trees that surrounded the farm. Juan stood there, looking the older man in the eyes without uttering a word. The threat was clear, but something inside him, something he had learned over the years in the ring, told him that it was time to act. Finally, Juan spoke. "What you do here doesn't interest me, but if you think you can intimidate the whole town, you're very wrong. I'm not afraid." The young man, furious at Juan's response, took a step forward, raising the knife. But the older man, with a quick gesture, stopped him. "Let's get out of here," he said, this time in a much graver tone of voice. "But we're watching you, old man, and we'll be back." Without saying another word, the two men got on their motorcycles and left. Juan, still standing at the door, watched them go without showing any emotion. Although he had managed to avoid a physical confrontation, he felt that the danger hadn't disappeared. The threat was real, and he knew that the conflict that was coming was going to be much bigger than he expected. As the thugs drove away, Juan went back into his house, closing the door behind him. As he sat in front of the wooden table, his mind couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Something inside him told him that this wasn't a threat that he could ignore for long. He knew that he would have to make a decision, confront these men, or prepare for a battle that could change his life forever. Night fell quickly on Santa Helena, and the rain didn't let up. Inside his house, Juan sat by the fireplace watching the flames dance. There was something about the fire that reminded him of his fighting days, the heat and violence of combat, that physical exertion that had defined him for years. But now, all that seemed far away, as if an eternity had passed since those days when his name resounded in the rings throughout the country. The sound of rain hitting the roof was monotonous, but it failed to calm the agitation he felt inside him. Although he didn't want to get involved in more fights, he felt that the thugs from yesterday wouldn't leave so easily. Something inside him awakened when he remembered his past, those lonely nights training in the gym, preparing for fights that made him famous. Sometimes he thought that fate had dragged him into that life, but he soon realized that it was he who had chosen the path of fighting. Suddenly, a noise snapped him out of his thoughts. A shadow moved behind the window, causing him to stand up immediately. His fighter instinct had kept him alert for years, and he still hadn't forgotten how to react to any threat. He walked silently to the door, peering through the crack. It wasn't the first time that something strange had happened. He remembered well the first time he decided to leave the city. He had left behind his family, his friends, and fame. He retired after a brutal fight, where he almost lost his life. He was young then, full of pride and arrogance, believing that life in the ring would be eternal. But a serious injury forced him to abandon the fight, and what came after was even more painful: loneliness. Memories began to invade his mind, like an old movie. The sound of the audience's applause, the feeling of hard blows, and above all, the intensity of the training. He was young, invincible, until one day something changed. After the injury, he began to see the world differently. The years of glory and fame no longer seemed so important. Life had hit him in the same way that rivals did in the ring. After all, what was the point of continuing to fight if the price was his life? Juan left that life behind. He bought a small farm in Santa Helena, moved away from the spotlight, and started a new life. No one knew much about his past, and he didn't care. He wanted peace, tranquility, something he couldn't find in the bright lights of his career. But now, as he looked through the window, he understood that the ghosts of the past never completely disappear. The sound of the thugs' motorcycles, their challenge, the threat that the older man had launched all shook him out of his routine. The past, so buried, was returning to find him again. And Juan knew that he couldn't keep running away. He moved away from the window and began to walk through the house, looking at the walls that were once filled with trophies and medals. Now, only memories remained in the form of dust. He stopped in front of an old photo in which he appeared lifting a champion's belt, smiling proudly. That smile no longer existed on his face. With a sigh, the photo fell to the ground, broken in two. What had been his life now seemed like an illusion, and everything he had built in Santa Helena was threatened by the same ghosts that had haunted him in the past. The next morning arrived with the same grey sky, but the atmosphere in Santa Helena was no longer the same. The air was charged with a palpable tension, as if the entire community sensed that something big was about to happen. Juan, after the last threat from the two men, couldn't relax. He felt that the calm of his previous life was no longer an option. The thugs hadn't left, and he knew they would be back. The problem was that this time the threat didn't only affect him, but the entire town. In the local market, news was spreading quickly. The neighbors murmured among themselves, and the men in the tavern commented on what had happened on Juan's farm. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something to happen, but no one knew what to do. Santa Helena had been a quiet place for years, but now the shadow of violence loomed over them. Juan had tried to continue with his routine, but the memory of the roaring motorcycles and the threats of the drug dealers haunted him. He couldn't ignore that he was on the verge of a conflict that he hadn't sought. He found himself facing a dilemma that he couldn't avoid: confront the men who threatened his home, or give in to their demands and lose the only thing he had managed to build. That afternoon, while Juan was fixing his farm, the voice of Rafael, an old friend from his fighting career, interrupted him. Rafael was a tall man, with skin tanned by years in the army. He had come to Santa Helena looking for a quiet place to retire, but he soon realized that the peace of the town was just an illusion. "Juan," Rafael said with a serious expression, "I know you've been staying away from all this, but you can't keep ignoring what's happening. Those guys aren't going to leave. The town is in danger." Juan stared at him. He didn't want to hear more of the same, but Rafael was right. The thugs weren't going to disappear. Rafael had been part of his life before he decided to leave everything behind, and although Juan owed him respect, there was something in him that resisted returning to violence. "I know, Rafael, but I don't want to involve anyone else in this. I'm not the man I used to be anymore," Juan replied, his voice full of doubt and weariness. Rafael took a step toward him and looked at him seriously. "You don't want to involve anyone else," Rafael repeated, as if the weight of the sentence forced him to reflect. "But the problem isn't just yours, Juan. They're already here, and if we don't do something, They're going to tear us all apart. You can't just wait for them to leave." Juan remained silent, knowing Rafael was right. For years he had maintained his peace, but now that peace was threatened by an external threat, he couldn't ignore. The temptation to return to the past, to the fight, to what he knew, was strong. But he also knew it would change him forever. At that moment, the motorcycle engines roared again in the distance. The same two men were approaching again, this time faster, more determined. Rafael watched Juan, who tensed at the sound of the motorcycles. He couldn't help it. Something inside him said that the confrontation was now inevitable. The thugs wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Rafael put a hand on Juan's shoulder and, in a firm tone, said, "Get ready. This is about to get real." Juan nodded silently, looking at the horizon where the motorcycles were approaching. There was no turning back. His past, his memories of fighting were calling him again. He knew that this time he would have to fight, not only for his life, but for the lives of everyone in the town. When the thugs arrived at his farm, Juan was ready. There was no fear in his eyes, only determination. The calm he had sought for so long no longer existed. The only way now was to face what was coming, with everything he had. The atmosphere of Santa Helena was charged with tension, as if the town itself were waiting for a storm. Juan, now determined to face the threat of the two thugs, couldn't afford to act alone. The situation had escalated too quickly, and the days of quiet life he had dreamed of seemed far away. At that moment, something he had never imagined became his only option: alliances. Rafael, his old friend and former soldier, had been on the battlefield for years, facing extreme situations. Although he had retired, his experience in dangerous situations made him a key person at this moment. Juan knew that if he wanted to survive, he would need someone with his tactical ability. "I don't have many options," Juan said to Rafael as they walked toward the shed, away from the curious eyes of the villagers. "I don't want to involve anyone else in this, but I can't face these guys alone." Rafael nodded, his face implacable. He knew that Juan was reluctant to ask for help, but he also understood that the situation had surpassed what they could handle on their own. "I know, brother, but it's not just about you. Now the town is involved. If we let them do what they want, this whole thing goes to hell. And you know it," Rafael replied, with a gaze fixed on the horizon, as if he were already seeing the conflict that was coming. Juan sighed, looking at the ground for a moment, taking a breath. He didn't want to do it, but he knew there was no other way out. If he wanted to protect what was left of his life, he would have to take a risk once again. "So what do we do?" he finally asked, looking at his friend with determination. Rafael smiled slightly, the experience of years on the battlefield reflected in his eyes. "The first thing is to get more people. You don't face these kinds of enemies with just good intentions, Juan. We need more allies, even if it's for the good of the town." At that moment, Juan couldn't help but think of Antonio, a man who had been his training partner in his fighting days. Antonio had left fighting years ago, after a fight that left him with serious injuries. Although he wasn't as strong as he used to be, his combat knowledge was invaluable. Without hesitation, Juan picked up the phone and dialed Antonio's number. Although his voice sounded tired on the other end of the line, he immediately agreed to help, without asking too many questions. He knew what it meant to face something like this. "I'll be there in 2 hours," Antonio said before hanging up. Meanwhile, Juan and Rafael began to plan what they would do. They knew that the drug dealers wouldn't stop pressing, and the only way to face them was with a precise strategy. Surprise would be their main advantage. Hours later, Antonio arrived at the farm with a bag of equipment and a determined look. Although he wasn't as fast as before, his presence commanded respect. Juan greeted him with a strong handshake, grateful to have him back on his side. "I don't know how you managed to convince him," Antonio commented, looking at Rafael, who simply nodded silently. "But it doesn't matter. What I know is that these guys aren't going to know what hit them." With Antonio's arrival, the small group felt stronger, although they knew that the problems were just beginning. Rafael had suggested a couple of strategic routes and some tactics to surprise the thugs, but everything depended on how the three of them acted together. The decision was made. They wouldn't run. They would face the threat head-on. We need to stay calm. Our advantage is that they don't know what they're up against," Raphael said as he unfolded a map of the area on the table, pointing out several key locations around the town. Antonio, with a calculating look, leaned toward the map. "We can use the old quarry on the outskirts of town. The men won't expect an ambush there. The only way they can beat us is if they underestimate what we're willing to do," he said firmly. Juan nodded, feeling the tension in the air. He knew that this would be the last resort. If they failed, they would not only lose the farm, but all the peace of Santa Helena would be destroyed. The conversation continued as they plotted the plan. As the sun set, the three men knew that what was coming wouldn't be easy, but now they had something they didn't have before: a plan and the certainty that they weren't alone. Night had fallen on Santa Helena, and the wind was still blowing strongly. Juan, Raphael, and Antonio were in the back of the farm, preparing everything needed for the ambush. Each had a specific task, and the hours they spent plotting the plan had refined every detail. The tension was palpable, but there was also a sense of determination in the air. They knew this would be their only chance to face the thugs who threatened the town. Raphael, with his military experience, had been in charge of designing the strategy. Juan, although reluctant to return to violence, understood that this was the only way. Antonio, for his part, seemed to have renewed energy as he returned to the battlefield, although his movements were no longer as fast as before. The plan was simple: lure the thugs to the quarry, a place far from the town where they could attack them without anyone interrupting them. But they knew that everything depended on how the thugs acted. If something went wrong, the situation could become even more dangerous. "It's now or never," Raphael said as he watched the night sky. The darkness was total, interrupted only by the dim light of a flashlight. Beside him, Juan adjusted his equipment, checking once again the weapons they had brought. "We can't give them the opportunity to surprise us," Antonio replied, adjusting his belt and making sure his knife was securely fastened. Juan, who had never been a man of arms, sat in an old wooden chair looking at the stars. Despite the tension, something inside him told him that all of this had been inevitable. His life had changed the day those two thugs arrived in town. Now he had to face what he had been avoiding for so long: violence. Meanwhile, the thugs, unaware of the danger that was being prepared, were approaching the town at full speed. The rain had stopped, but the ground was slippery, which made their advance difficult. However, they didn't know that the three men were already there, waiting in silence. The trap was set, but there was no way of knowing if they would fall into it. Every second that passed brought them closer to a confrontation. Suddenly, the sound of motorcycles broke the silence. The thugs had arrived. Raphael, who was watching from a hidden position among the trees, signaled Juan and Antonio to prepare. The thugs stopped near the entrance to the quarry, unaware that a danger much greater than they could imagine awaited them there. Juan, with controlled breathing, stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. The men suspected nothing. They didn't know that behind every stone and every tree, there was a plan waiting to be executed. "Everything ready, right?" Juan asked his companions, looking at Raphael and Antonio with a fixed gaze. "Everything is under control," Raphael replied in a low voice. "Now we just have to wait." The thugs began to advance toward the quarry. When they passed the first ambush point, Juan and Antonio moved quickly toward them, surrounding them on both flanks. However, the thugs, realizing that they had been tricked, reacted immediately. One of them pulled out a gun and fired into the air, creating momentary confusion. "It's a trap!" shouted the older man, raising his voice in fury. Juan, without hesitation, lunged at him, using his fighting skills that he had perfected over the years. The two began to fight, with Juan dodging every blow that the older man tried to land. For a moment, it seemed that the advantage was on his side, but the thug was stronger than he seemed. Meanwhile, Antonio was facing the young man with the scar. This one, although smaller, was more agile and quickly managed to hit Antonio in the side. However, Antonio, with years of experience on the battlefield, was quick to repel the attack and give him a precise blow to the stomach, knocking him to the ground. The fight was at its peak when suddenly, the older man, seeing that his companions were falling one after another, retreated toward his motorcycle. However, Juan wasn't going to let him escape so easily. In a last effort, he lunged at him, grabbing him by the jacket and knocking him to the ground. "You're not going to get away so easily," Juan growled, while holding him immobilized. The thug tried to get up, but Juan held him tighter, making sure he didn't escape. The battle was over, but the price had been high. Antonio and Rafael approached, breathing heavily, but relieved by the victory. "We did it," Antonio said, with an exhausted smile on his face. Juan nodded, looking at the older man who now lay at his feet, unable to move. "But this isn't over yet," Juan replied with a determined look. He knew that this confrontation had only been the beginning of a war that could change everything. The dust raised by the battle still hung in the air, mixed with the sweat and tension that had accumulated during the confrontation. Juan stood in front of the older man, who lay on the ground, immobilized and without the strength to get up. Around him, Antonio and Rafael were still catching their breath, but the danger had not completely disappeared. They knew that the leader of the drug dealers would not be defeated so easily. Juan looked at his friend Antonio, who was still leaning against a rock, breathing heavily. Rafael, for his part, had already begun to check the surroundings, looking for any sign of more thugs who might be lurking. Although the older man was captured, the situation was still dangerous. They knew that if the leader of the drug dealers escaped, not only his farm would be in danger, but the entire town. "What do we do now?" Antonio asked as he approached Juan, his eyes full of weariness but also determination. "We can't let these guys keep controlling the town." Juan, with tense muscles and a fixed gaze, knew that he had to act quickly. The ambush had gone well, but the confrontation had not been definitive. If they didn't make a decision now, everything could happen again. The drug dealers could return with more force, and their only goal would be to destroy everything that Juan had achieved. "This man," Juan said, pointing to the thug who was still on the ground, "is not just a criminal. He's the tip of the iceberg. If we don't stop him here and now, there will be more. And the worst thing is that we have no guarantee that we can win next time." Rafael, who had been watching carefully, approached Juan and put a hand on his shoulder. "I know," he replied in a grave tone, "but we're not alone. This town has been living in fear for a long time. If we stand idly by, we'll be giving up everything we've worked for." Juan nodded slowly, feeling the weight of Rafael's words. The town couldn't continue to be under the threat of the drug dealers. They had to make a decision now, but the question remained the same: what to do with the man they had in front of them? The older man, still immobilized, raised his head and looked at Juan with fury in his eyes. Although his body was exhausted, his gaze still reflected the latent threat of someone who had not been completely defeated. "This isn't over, old man," he growled, his voice full of hatred. "If you think we've lost, you're wrong. We'll be back, and this time you won't be saved." Juan, without hesitation, stared at him. He knew that the man was defeated, but his words still had a weight that disturbed him. "I know," Juan replied as he made a decision that would change everything, "but we won't let you come back. This ends here." With a quick movement, Juan signaled Rafael, who understood instantly. Rafael approached the older man and lifted him up, holding him firmly by the shoulders. Meanwhile, Antonio approached Juan, showing on his face the same determination that he felt. "What do we do now?" Antonio asked, looking at the man with contempt. "Now we give him one last chance," Juan replied, his tone firm and decisive. "We're going to take him to the town. Let him see what he has caused us. If he has something to say, let him say it before the people." Rafael, with an expression that left no room for doubt, nodded. They knew that this was the last chance. If they let the man escape, everything they had done would be in vain. If they didn't make a firm decision, everything that had happened would still be a game for the drug dealers. But Juan was no longer willing to allow fear and violence to take over his life again. Together, the three men led the drug lord towards the town, unhurried but with determination. They knew they couldn't let their past catch up to them, that the fight for peace in Santa Helena couldn't just be an empty promise. As they walked towards the town center, people watched from their homes, curious but also relieved by the presence of the three men. Juan knew that, although it wasn't over yet, something had changed. He wasn't the only one fighting anymore. Now the whole community was involved. The older man, unable to move quickly, tried to remain firm, but defeat was already evident on his face. His eyes, once full of anger, were beginning to reflect an uncertainty that betrayed him. Juan stopped in the town square, where all eyes fell on them. The drug lord looked at the people, knowing that the defeat wasn't just physical, but also psychological. The people were no longer afraid. The fight had begun. "It ends here," Juan said with a firm voice, looking the older man in the eyes. "We don't belong to you anymore. Santa Helena is ours, and you will never take it again." The wind continued to blow strongly in the Santa Helena square, carrying with it the feeling that something important had changed. The people had come out of their houses upon hearing the noises, and now everyone watched in silence as Juan, Rafael, and Antonio, with the drug lord held between them, stopped in the center of town. The quiet voices of the villagers mixed with the sound of the leaves moving in the wind. No one dared to speak, but everyone waited to see what the three men would do. Juan, with his gaze fixed on the older man who had been terrorizing his town, felt the weight of his decision. They had fought, and now what followed was crucial. It wasn't enough to defeat the thugs. Now he had to make sure that his town would never again be a victim of fear. And for that, he needed to make a decision that would make a difference. "Take him to the center, Rafael," Juan said with a firm voice, although a slight doubt ran through him. He knew he couldn't give in at this moment. Everything had led to this, and if he didn't resolve this situation correctly, nothing they had done would make sense. Rafael nodded and pushed the older man towards the center of the square, where the villagers' gazes watched them. Juan and Antonio followed, not losing sight of the thug, who seemed like he still didn't understand what was happening. For a moment, the drug lord raised his head and looked at the villagers with contempt. "Listen to me," the man shouted with a raspy voice. "This isn't over. You don't know who we are. We'll be back and no one will be able to stop us." The villagers, who until that moment had remained silent, began to whisper among themselves, but no one dared to reply. Juan, standing in front of the man, couldn't let this threat go unanswered. "There are no more threats," Juan said calmly. "The people of this town have suffered too much, but it's over. Now you and your friends are just a part of the past." The older man, still on his knees, tried to get up, but Rafael pressed him back to the ground, leaving him in a position of humiliation. "You have two options," Juan said, looking at the villagers who were beginning to approach as they felt the weight of his words. "The first, leave now, take your companions and never come back. The second, face the consequences of what you've done." The tension in the air was thick. The town was waiting for his next move, and Juan knew that this would be the moment that defined their future. If he let the older man go without further ado, the drug dealers would continue to be a shadow over Santa Helena. If he took drastic measures, he would show that violence would never again dominate their home. But at that moment, something inside Juan told him that he had to go further. "We're not going to let you go so easily," he said decisively, looking at the man who was now sweating, defeated. "The people of Santa Helena have been humiliated enough. This isn't just a battle. It's a message for everyone who wants to continue terrorizing us. We're not giving up anymore." At that moment, one of the oldest villagers, Mr. Alfredo, approached slowly, his face marked by years of struggle and resistance in life. With a look that denoted wisdom, he spoke calmly. "Juan, what you have done today has given hope to all of us. Fear no longer governs us, but what will you do with this man? Do you really think that what you do now will change anything?" Juan looked at the older man, who was still trying to break free from Rafael's pressure. The drug lord seemed defeated, but Juan knew that the real test was whether he let him go or made him pay for his actions. With a deep breath, Juan made a decision. He looked at the villagers, then at the man, and firmly said, "We will make sure that they can never harm anyone again. This man will be handed over to justice, and if he ever tries to return, he will be facing an entire community willing to fight for what is theirs." The silence that followed his words was profound. The villagers began to applaud slowly, with respect, while the older man finally understood that his time was over. Rafael, with a determined look, lifted him off the ground and pushed him towards the group of villagers who took charge of taking him to the local authorities. Juan looked at the villagers, feeling a mixture of relief and responsibility. He was no longer alone. The town had shown that even in moments of darkness, unity and courage could defeat fear. As the older man was led towards his destiny, Juan stood there in the center of the square looking around. He knew that this victory was not the end, but it was the beginning of something much bigger, the return of peace to Santa Helena. The tension in Santa Helena had reached its peak. After the arrest of the drug lord, Juan knew that peace had not yet arrived. The sound of motorcycles getting closer and closer confirmed to him that the battle was not over yet. Carlos's thugs were returning, this time with reinforcements. The community, which had begun to breathe with relief, was threatened again. Juan, Rafael, and Antonio stood at the entrance to the town, ready to face what was coming. In the distance, the roar of the motorcycles announced the arrival of the storm. The older man, still captured, watched with fury, while Carlos at the front seemed more determined than ever. Juan didn't hesitate for a second. "Prepare the defenses," he ordered, as the thugs began to approach. Carlos, with a defiant smile, raised his hand, giving the signal to attack. The men began to advance quickly. Rafael and Antonio, with impeccable coordination, faced the closest thugs. Juan, with his fighting experience, lunged towards the most dangerous ones, knocking them down one after another. The fight seemed balanced, but the numerical superiority of the drug dealers was evident. In an instant, when everything seemed to be going well, a thug appeared in the crowd with a grenade in his hands. Juan reacted instinctively, pushing Rafael and Antonio towards a nearby wall while shouting, "Watch out!" The explosion was devastating. The ground shook and the air filled with dust and debris. Juan, stunned by the shockwave, struggled to stay on his feet. When the dust began to settle, he could see that his friends were still alive, but the situation had changed completely. The thugs quickly regrouped, and the battle, now fiercer than ever, seemed to be lost for them. Carlos, seeing the opportunity, advanced towards Juan. With a cry of rage, he lunged to attack him, but just as he raised his fist to hit him, Rafael appeared out of nowhere, stopping him with impressive force. "This town is not yours," Rafael shouted, knocking Carlos to the ground. With the drug lord finally defeated, the thugs began to retreat, fearful of what had just happened. The fight continued, but the morale of the attackers was plummeting. Santa Helena was not only defending itself, it was also demonstrating its strength and unity. But at that moment, the biggest surprise of all arrived. The villagers, who had watched everything from their homes, came forward, armed with what they had: bats, sticks, and even farm tools. The entire town rose up, united by a single goal: to expel the drug dealers from their home. The change was immediate. The drug dealers, seeing that the town was rising up against them, began to doubt. It was no longer just Juan and his friends who were fighting, but an entire community willing to defend what was theirs. Carlos, with his face bloody and despair reflected in his eyes, saw how his army was crumbling. The remaining thugs retreated quickly, unable to do anything against the power of a united town. The leader, defeated and humiliated, was captured by the villagers and taken away, while victory settled in the air. The battle for Santa Helena had not only been won, but the town had shown that although fear had reigned for a while, it no longer had a place in their hearts.